Right, well, something has happened on my little pad here that encourages me that we have our friend from India, another friend from India, available online now. Here we go, fantastic technology. Arunabha Ghosh, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India, another kind of example of bringing together the nexus. And so we're going to have another contribution. Let's hope it comes through loud and clear. Arunabha, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I can hear you very loud and very clearly. Can you hear me?
ODI technology, we love it. Okay, so the floor is yours, and we will do our best to orchestrate conversation that you are included in. But when you're finished, we'll turn to the audience here. Actually, we'll turn to Mary first, and then the audience afterwards. So, Arunabha Ghosh, your floor is yours from India.
Well, thank you, James. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to ODI and to Honourable Mary Robinson for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm sorry I'm not with you because we've been chipping away at another dimension of climate change here, along with Sir David King and the Chinese Expert Committee on Climate Change and Harvard on climate risk and how do we begin to understand the risk that it poses to our human systems. So we were engaged in an exercise that ended just a few minutes ago, so I'm sorry I couldn't teletransport myself into London, but this is as good as any. I didn't have an opportunity to listen to the earlier speakers except Sheila, and I concur with a lot of the points that she raised. So I'm going to simply structure my comments along sort of 3 or 4 broad points, and then we can, of course, discuss more when we get into the Q&A. The first broad point I wanted to touch upon, and that's from the Indian perspective, is just to understand what's changing in India in terms of the approach towards at least mitigating climate change or changing our energy mix, especially under the new government. Some of you might have heard and some of you might not have, but since the government has been in power for the last about 9.5 months, some major announcements have come forward, and 2 of them particularly are important. The first is that we have significantly ramped up our targets for solar power. The original national solar mission was for 20,000 megawatts by 2022 of grid-connected solar power, combined with another 2,000 megawatts of off-grid power by that same year. And that was part of the National Action Plan on Climate Change. Now, what has happened under the new government is that we've now got a target which is 5 times as large and 30 times as large as what is currently deployed, going all the way up to 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022. The other big change is the way we've been ramping up our version of the carbon tax. Since 2010, India has been imposing a cess on every ton of coal used in the country, both imported and domestic, and until the new government came into power, it was 50 rupees, so about 90 cents, 90 US cents on every ton of coal. Now, in July, in its interim budget, the government doubled it to 100 rupees, and then last month, in its first full budget, it doubled it again to 200 rupees. So there's one more dimension, one more big thing that's changing, which is our overall sense of how aggressive we could get on renewable energy. And there was a working group on low carbon strategy for India that suggested where we could get to about 800, 900 billion units of electricity from renewables in 2030. Our calculations at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water suggest that we can do a little bit even more, maybe about a little over 1 trillion units of electricity from renewables. And just to put it in context, India produces a total of 1 trillion units of electricity currently. So this kind of transformation, this significant uptake of renewables, is something that India is trying to attempt in a span of about 10 to 15 years, what Germany did over a period of 21 years. Now, why do I say all of this? Since I don't represent the government, I wasn't intending to just simply market government policies, but why do I raise this in a session on what is the role of non-state actors? So let's reflect back again on how did our renewables revolution initially get started? And I might be throwing in I might be stretching reality slightly because I don't know all the details, but the way we started off in wind was broadly like this. Mr. Tulsi Tanti was not in the wind industry originally. He was a Gujarati industrialist, and like many other industrialists in India, was suffering from intermittent supply of electricity that obviously affects your businesses. So at some exhibition, he found a wind turbine, and he bought it and he stuck it on his plant, and he started generating electricity. So his plant was in an industrial cluster. So some of his neighboring industrialists saw that and said, "Hey, where did you get that from?" He said, "Well, I got it at an exhibition." And he said, "Okay, could you procure one for us?" And he goes and gets a few more wind turbines for some other folks. And that just kicks off, in a sense, how a regular industrialist gets into procuring wind turbines and then realizes that that business model actually makes more sense than making T-shirts or whatever it is he was making earlier. But then the real boom comes from some government policies that allows for accelerated depreciation and so forth. So this is where what Shalag was talking about is that you can't simply wish away the government, even though the initial kick might be coming, or the initial innovations might be coming from the non-state actors. The big question then is, what do we do in terms of leverage? So by doubling or now quadrupling the carbon tax, we would be getting about $1.5 billion into the kitty just by imposing that cess on coal every year. Now, the question is, do you use that kind of state revenue to subsidize projects, or do you use it to leverage private investment in a much bigger way? But the problem is we don't really know how to do that. And therefore, much of what right now sits in our National Clean Energy Fund has not yet been disbursed. So we've got this challenge that while we are moving forward with aggressive targets, while we're moving forward with very impressive policies on carbon taxation and so forth, we're still not clear exactly how, in what kind of a transparent way, can we support the non-state actors in whatever they're trying to do. That brings me to my second point, which is about energy access. And just to kind of think about energy access in an Indian context, just think of the number 750, which is the number of households that we would need to electrify between now and 2025, so the next 10 years, every single hour, if we have to cover just the backlog in the households that don't have electricity, assuming every new household from tomorrow onwards already is connected to electricity. So 750 households have to be electrified every single hour for the next 10 years. Okay, so that's the scale of the challenge or the opportunity. Now, to step in, of course, there are government programs for rural electrification and all of that, but somewhere in all of this have come in about 250 entrepreneurs. Most government officials did not know that so many existed. We went around the forests and districts across India trying to find them, and we estimate there are at least 250 firms in India operating in decentralized energy. If you look at their supply chains, then you get a list of about 1,100 institutions. Now, these are not large utilities. These are tiny players with very little working capital, with very little money to scale up. But they are innovating not just in technologies, but particularly in business models. And when you unpack their business models, you look at they're making decisions on what kind of technology mix. They're looking at whether they'll operate in a village or in a district or at a state level. They're considering whether they will manufacture their products or import them, say, from China. They're trying to decide whether there will be for-profit entities or social enterprises, depending on the tax systems that are available. And then most importantly, they're trying to decide what is their investment model. Would it be from the firm or from the households? And what would be their revenue model? Would it be a single-time sale, or would it be trying to do pay-per-service and things like that? Now, what's challenging about all of this, while it's all exciting, and I can regale you with many examples of innovations that are happening on the ground, What's really challenging is that to scale up this kind of off-the-grid effort, off-the-grid not just in terms of the electricity grid, but off-the-grid in terms of even the policy frameworks, is that when you look at scale up, you're immediately coming up against the policy frameworks. So you could be operating in 1 or 2 villages or 5 villages, but when you look at scaling up to 20 villages, there are issues of whether the subsidies that might be available, will they flow through to the households on time and so forth, whether finance is available for scaling up, or were these just demonstration projects or little corporate social responsibility kind of investments? And more particularly, how do you get the skills, say 50,000 to train 50,000 people to go all out into the fields to do this stuff? So the question here for the non-state actors, not just these tiny players, but the big finance guys, is how do you begin to funnel big money into large numbers of small projects, even if you aggregate them, even if you try and normalize the risk? What would be the intermediary institutions through which you would funnel big money, whether it's institutional investors sitting outside India or large banks in India? And unless we are able to resolve that, we kind of suffer from both the excitement of innovation on the ground and the desperation and the despondency that comes from the inability to scale. And that then brings me to my third and final point, which is what do we do for technologies or businesses that don't exist so far? So a few years ago, we facilitated at CEW, an initiative that was originally announced by the government of the United States and government of India, called the Joint Clean Energy R&D Centers. And the idea here was, let's go beyond what just the climate negotiations are all about technology coming from somewhere else, but instead trying to develop those technologies jointly. And the government's promised that they would put in $25 million each, so long as there were private consortia that would put in equivalent amount of money. But the problem is we didn't know who would form those private consortia, and the governments did not really have a strategy along those lines either. So we held roadshows in Delhi, in Hyderabad, in southern India, in New York, and got about 600 institutions to begin to talk to each other, got in the IP lawyers, got them to think about how do you form consortia that have Indian and US institutions. And guess what? The so-called private non-state consortia came up not with $50 million, but with $75 million. So an initial program of $100 million became a $125 million R&D initiative in solar, energy efficiency, and second-generation biofuels. The question that arises from there is, at what stage would private sector or non-state actors come in with big money to invest in transformational R&D? And transformational R&D not just in terms of technology, but particularly in terms of the business models or adaptability of those technologies in various markets. Would it require co-financing, equivalent financing from governments, or are there ways to trigger that? If 600 institutions can be talking to each other, could something like that have happened outside of the government framework altogether? Why weren't they talking to each other before the governments had announced such a program? So I've already spoken for about 13 minutes, so I'm going to stop there and just leave you with those 3 big questions. If we have to take the robust kind of ambitions that governments are announcing, how do we leverage money that's sitting in the kitty, but we don't really know how to deploy? Number 2, if we have to encourage the small players, the small non-state actors, and encourage their innovations, how do we funnel big finance into large numbers of small projects? And number 3, if we have to think about transformational R&D, at what stage and through what mechanisms can we bring together large numbers of different types of institutions to pool in their resources to do more than they could have done individually? So let me stop there. Thanks again for your attention.
Arunabha, I would rather like you to answer your own questions. We had a conversation earlier. I'm particularly interested in the intermediary function because I think it's possible there are many ways to do this, but the missing piece, as I see it, is intermediaries that understand the private capital markets, that understand that there are rules and disciplines and objectives that are associated with delivery of public good, including, of course, that by national governments, but there's also a need to blend what public finance is around in order to scale up. And we seem to lack those sorts of intermediaries, and not just in India. So I would very much like to know what your thoughts are about how we crack some of the critical questions that you have asked, and whether we should be, whether you've got some ideas you'd like to share.
Well, well, to answer your question on intermediaries, I think it's not that there aren't institutions that have deep penetration. Again, take India's example for a second. We have a large bank called the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. Now, this NABARD bank, its traditional role, its role particularly expanded under the Green Revolution, was to basically give loans to farmers when they buy seeds or fertilizer. But it also has one of the largest networks of rural banks in the world, let alone in India. So when we go and talk to NABARD, we say, listen, you're the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. So it's not just agricultural loans that you need to be giving out. Maybe there's a new market here in terms of putting solar panels on people's roofs, or financing solar pump sets for farmers' irrigation needs. So they have the penetration. What they struggle with, and that's where intermediaries, and we've spoken to others as well, is that they say that still the transaction size are so small that it's not worth our cost. So for us, we can pass through government subsidies and just charge a small fee, as a pass-through mechanism, but actually begin to aggregate these projects and figure out their risks and then put a kind of risk premium on it or underwrite that risk is not something that we are necessarily interested in. So the question here then is, if various countries, so if it's India here or Kenya or Cambodia, they have these state-run institutions that do have the networks, are there other players outside of these countries that can come in with the ability to quickly, pull together the portfolio of projects that they can then present to these intermediary agencies? I mean, if Coca-Cola can get, a Coca-Cola distributed to the deepest forests anywhere in the world through its logistics networks, it's not just the logistics; it's found businesses, etc., that are viable enough to leverage, no matter how small the sales are from each point of sale. So I'm not saying selling solar is as easy as selling Coca-Cola, especially since solar doesn't have as much sugar in it. But the point is, we have not yet explored. We always think of intermediaries as the ones who are simply going to pass through the money. We have not found the intermediaries that are going to actually go down into the field and put all of those projects together into one portfolio. Very quickly on the leverage point, I think the simple answer from my end at least would be that it's not so much as leveraging $1 or 1 rupee of public money into 5 or 6 rupees of private money. I think it has to be about underwriting risk because developing countries anyway have higher interest rates than elsewhere. And then you're adding a further risk, then you have high inflation, then you have adding higher interest risk premiums to it. So you use public money to underwrite as much of that risk as possible, and rather than trying to either directly subsidize or just do a simple, I'll put in 20% and then private sector will put in another 40-50%. So those would be my two quick answers, but I'm happy to get some reactions on the floor before I have other observations.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Really helpful. We're just going to move swiftly on. We're a little bit behind time.